From north of the 49th parallel, America can be very hard to read these days. It's long touted itself as the land of the free and the home of the brave, but perhaps that's less true now than it once was, judging by a new book from social psychologist Jonathan Haidt and his co-author Greg Lukianoff. It's called The Coddling of the American Mind: How Good Intentions and Bad Ideas Are Setting Up a Generation for Failure. And with that, we welcome Jonathan Haidt in New York City back to tell us what this is all about. Nice to see you again, Jonathan. How are you doing?
Nice to see you too, Steve.
I want to start with something very small, but of course, often small things tell a bigger story, and the small things I want to start with are called peanuts. Every parent knows that the best way to make enemies at your kid's school is to make them a peanut butter and jam sandwich, because everybody has an explosion about that, and that's verboten. But what is it that you think peanut allergies tell us about the state of American culture today?
In the United States, as in a number of countries, peanut allergies have been rising. And the mystery as to why they're rising is kind of I'd almost say a metaphor for the whole book, but it's actually a homology, meaning it's the same process. What I mean by that is the rate of peanut allergies is only rising in countries that recommend that pregnant women avoid peanuts and avoid giving their kids peanuts. And so when my son was starting preschool, and at the age of 3, we got a long lecture on all the peanut products and things that had been near peanuts and things that looked like peanuts and anything with a P in it we weren't supposed to bring to school. And later on, as I looked into it, what I discovered is that there was recently a study showing that if they recruited 600 women who'd recently given birth, whose kids were at risk of peanut allergy. Half were given the standard advice to avoid peanuts, keep them away from your kid. Half were told, here's some kind of a snack that is a corn puff with peanut dust on it. Give it to your kid. And at the age of 5, it turned out that the kids who followed standard advice, 14% of them had a peanut allergy. So for the rest of their lives, they're going to have to be careful. And in the half that were given peanuts, 2% had a peanut allergy. The point is, when we're protecting kids, we're protecting them from things that they actually need to get stronger. The immune system needs to be exposed to all kinds of things in order to learn. In the same way, kids need to be exposed. They need to fall down in order to get a sense of balance. They need to be teased and excluded in order to learn how to navigate the social world. They need to take risks on the playground in order to know how to face physical risks when they're older. We've been depriving kids of these things, and this, we think, is one of the major reasons why rates of anxiety, depression, and even suicide are way up among American youth.
If the adverse consequences of infantilizing and overprotecting and doing all of these things that your peanut metaphor just describes, why do we do it?
2 reasons. One is because the natural urge to protect is so strong. We all want to protect our kids. And even though many of us, I talk with a lot of parents here in New York, most of us hate helicopter parenting, but we do it anyway. Because in each particular case, you just want to protect, even though you know that the long run could be harmful. The other reason is that there's a lot of social pressure. So I wanted to let my kids go out alone on Halloween. My 12-year-old son did. We live in New York City. It's actually very, very safe. My 8-year-old daughter was just sort of on the borderline, and I wanted to let her go out, but she had a friend with her, and we'd have to get clearance from the friend's parents. So you risk social shame, and in parts of America, you risk arrest. Beginning in the early 2000s, we started hearing about American parents getting arrested because their 8, 9, 10-year-old kids were caught playing in a park with no adult supervision, and they could get snatched, which never really happens, but that's what we think in our paranoia.
Don't you wish you lived in Utah?
That's right. Yes. Well, overall, I'm still happy I live in New York. But Utah did become the first state in the United States to pass a free-range parenting bill, which specifically says, it's crazy that we have to do this, but it specifically says that you can give your kids some freedom and you won't be arrested for it, that shall not be taken as evidence that you are an unfit parent. And so that's the first step. Every state in the United States has to pass this. And I hear horror stories from Canada, too. There was a father, I think it was in Alberta, he was arrested because his 5 kids, he taught them how to take the bus, and they took the bus, the public bus, to get to school. And the oldest was, I think, 12 or something like that. So you've got your problems, too.
What kind of sign of the times is it when you can be arrested for parenting with a bit of a long leash?
So in part, this reflects what Greg and I call problems of progress. So, it used to be 100 years ago, kids were sent to the factories and the coal mines, or 150 years ago. As we get richer, safety standards improve. As we get richer, women get more educated, the birth rate plummets. When I was a kid, there were a lot of families around that had 4 or 5 kids. Now there are very few. When you have one kid, boy, you're more likely to overprotect, to feel you have all your eggs in one basket. So for a lot of reasons, we are investing more in our kids. In America, at least, it's gotten so much more competitive to get into college if you're in the middle class or above and you have high aspirations. So we're taking playtime away from kids because we want them to study piano or violin or math or something else that will help get them into college. Basically, we're taking away the experiences that they most need and giving them experiences that actually aren't going to do anything for them in the long run.
Well, if we allowed kids to play, quote unquote, the right way, which is the way that you think is better for them in the long run, what does that actually look like?
What it looks like is what kids do all over the world, unstructured free play. All over the world, kids are let out. They form play groups, mixed age. It turns out playing in mixed age is really valuable because the older kids learn how to adjust, how to be empathic towards the needs of the little kids. The little kids might get hurt, but because there's big kids around, they don't want to cry, so they learn self-control. They have to make up rules flexibly depending on who's there. They learn skills of self-governance. Basically, kids, when you leave them to their own devices, will invent games, and they're basically learning the skills of democracy. They're learning how to make decisions as a group without having to appeal to a higher authority to come in and punish. It's a very important phrase, moral dependency. Moral dependency is when you can no longer solve your own moral conflicts. You have to appeal to an adult to come in on your side to punish someone else. Beginning, I think, in the 1990s or 2000s, we've been hyper-regulating kids' lives. By the time they get to college, there's always been an adult present. There's always been someone that they can report to. They're often told, if you see something, say something. So beginning around 2013, what Greg and I began to notice is that on college campuses, if a kid overheard a joke they didn't like, or if a teacher was assigning a book or that they didn't like, or a speaker was going to come that they didn't like, they wouldn't just ignore it or talk to the person. They would go to a dean. They would ask for a remedy, some sort of bureaucratic protection. This is moral dependency. It's not the kids' fault. We did this to them when they were younger.
In 2013, there was a new generation that entered the universities, since you've got us onto the post-secondary sector here. And this is how you summarize the so-called iGen. iGen is the first generation that spent and is now spending its formative teen years immersed in the giant social and commercial experiment of social media. What could go wrong, you add sarcastically. So, what did go wrong?
So it turns out the iPhone is invented in 2007. Facebook opens up to the world in 2006. Most teenagers don't have it in 2006, 2007, but by 2009, 2010, a lot, and by 2011, 2012, most American teenagers have a smartphone in their pocket and social media, which they're checking dozens or often hundreds of times a day. For the millennials, that is, we all thought that the college students today were millennials, but now we know that behaviorally, if you look at how they spend their time, if you look at how they are emotionally, there's an amazingly sharp line at birth year 1995. It's about as sharp as birth year 1946, a very sharp line for the baby boom generation. Kids born in 1995 and afterwards had a very different childhood than any previous group in history because so many of them got on social media when they were about 12 or 13. And we didn't know what would happen. Now it looks like it is absolutely devastating to girls. So when boys get smartphones, they spend a lot of time playing video games. There's a big debate as to how bad that is. It's not that bad, especially when they're cooperating, they're running around imaginary worlds killing people, as my son and his friends do. But for girls, there's the social comparison, there's the beauty comparison, how popular you are, fear of missing out, and the nature of girls' aggression is against each other's relationships. Boys' bullying is physical, so social media doesn't change it. Girls' bullying has always been relational, and social media accelerates it by an order of magnitude. So what we're seeing in the United States and the UK, the stats are very, very clear. And I was just looking, I need to do a lot more research for Canada, but I've seen some research that self-harm, that is cutting yourself to the point where you have to be admitted to the hospital, is going up in Canada as well. In all 3 countries, girls' mental health is plummeting. Again, I don't know as much about Canada, but in the UK and the United States, rates of anxiety, depression, self-harm, and suicide, The suicide rate for American teenage girls is up enormously. For boys, it's up 25% from the first decade of the century. For girls, it's up 70%. So this is a catastrophe. We're not sure that most of that is from social media. We don't know. But that's the most likely candidate.
While you were in the midst of that answer, we did put up a graph that showed the percentage of male versus female college students in the United States who say they have a psychological disorder. And while the lines are not exactly what you would call a hockey stick, they are certainly trending in the wrong direction. You say young people are growing up more slowly these days. Now, why would that be the case, given the infinite added amounts of sophisticated gadgetry and wizardry and knowledge they have access to right now?
Because you don't grow up by learning things like facts. You don't grow up by doing things on an app. You grow up by pushing the envelope. You grow up by doing things that you weren't able to do the year before. And so the reason why I say kids grow up slowly, I'm taking that straight from Jean Twenge. She's a professor at the University of San Diego. And she has this wonderful book, iGen, iGen or Gen Z. In Canada, you may know it as Gen Z. It's the generation after the millennials. And what she shows is that if you look at what percentage of them get a driver's license by the time they're 18. When I was a kid, I mean, if the DMV was closed, you might wait a day, but you got your driver's license the minute you could. But nowadays, a lot of kids don't even bother to get a driver's license because they don't go out as much. They don't date as much. They don't have a job as often. They don't drink as much. They don't do drugs as much. What are they doing? They're sitting at home, sitting on their bed, engaging with each other over social media. They're not pushing any envelopes. They are playing social games that, maybe in theory they could have had some benefits, but it looks like they are harmful. Basically, kids are not getting the adult-like experiences that teenagers traditionally got. So when they arrive at college, a lot of them fall apart. At American universities, this is all over. At American universities, every place I've been, and we've got data in the book to back it up, the mental health service is saying, we're overwhelmed. Our waiting list is now months long. We're going to have people committing suicide because we can't get to them. So this is just since about 2013, 2014. As soon as iGen or Gen Z, as soon as they arrive on campus, the need for mental health resources skyrockets.
Now, political correctness, of course, there's nothing new in that, and I can remember doing my first interviews here about that, 25, 30 years ago. But this generation, Generation Z, as we would call it necessarily in Canada, not Z, but Z.
Okay,
Z. Since they entered universities, this cohort has changed the nature of political correctness and what professors have to do and what they have to be careful not to do. Fill us in a bit more on that, if you would.
Sure. So there's two separate processes. One is waves of political correctness and student protest. And this is the third one in my lifetime. So when I was a little kid, in the 1960s, I remember I was, 5 years old, and my friends and I would go around, saying peace, peace, because that's what the hippies were doing. And then when I was in graduate school in the late 80s, early 90s, there was another wave of political correctness and student protest to diversify the curriculum. And that was generally successful. And now we're in a third wave, and it's about issues of diversity and inclusion. So that's a normal process for there to be waves of activism. What's new, what we've never seen before, is the way that activism is changed when it is placed on top of this new psychological fragility. This is what's new. The students aren't saying, we don't want that speaker to come because he's outrageous or he's racist. I mean, they'll say that. But the argument is, but if he comes, there will be bodies on our side. There will be dead bodies. There will be trauma. There will be suffering. It's a medicalization of the intellectual world. So many young people today, they've been raised with this horrible concept of emotional safety. Emotional safety means that you're not upset. And they're raised to believe that if they're feeling upset, if they're feeling anxious, then they're not emotionally safe. Now imagine having a conversation about anything that's going to question your existing values, your core values. Yeah, it's uncomfortable. I mean, this is what Socrates specialized in, and this is what we've thought of ourselves. Professors have thought this is what we do for about 2,300 years, is we're supposed to be provocative. I was a very provocative teacher up until about 2014, 2015. I've stopped. Because if a student feels emotionally unsafe, they think that an offense has taken place, and there is a phone number and a website and a place to go to report such professors for making them feel unsafe. This puts a chill on everybody. Survey data from American college students and college students shows while they are often afraid of speaking up because of their professors, they're afraid that their professors might criticize them, they're more afraid of other students. And anecdotally, that's what I find from professors, that we are teaching defensively because even though most of our students are wonderful, in any class there's going to be a few that will take offense, are looking to take offense, and might report you for saying something that they think is insensitive.
What if we take a more sensitive look at that approach, though? Namely, something like you're a distinguished, tall, white, experienced male at the head of that classroom, and you don't know, but there may be somebody in that classroom who has been the frequent victim of racism or who has been the victim of a sexual assault at some point, and there may be something that you teach that will, quote unquote, trigger them to relive a very uncomfortable experience, and it will have a very negative adverse effect. Is that a legitimate concern?
No, it's not, because that's what people say in terms of trigger warnings, why we need to give trigger warnings. But that's not the way PTSD works. PTSD is extraordinarily rare. Trauma is not uncommon. I mean, trauma is, many students have been exposed to trauma, but very few people get PTSD. Those that actually have it are very few on campus, and they need to be in treatment. What we've seen is the spread of the idea of PTSD out to the point where many people think that if they've had a bad experience and something reminds them of it, that reminder has to be eliminated. And we spoke to a lot of clinical psychologists when writing the book, and they all said the same thing. They said, keeping people away from reminders, triggers they'd call them, keeping people away from reminders is not a treatment for PTSD, it's a symptom of it. It's the way you get over that is by being exposed to things in an environment that will not be followed by actual violence. So a classroom is the best possible place to read a novel that has sexual violence in it, or to encounter an argument that might have some uncomfortable implications. We have this wonderful quote from Van Jones, an African-American progressive activist, part of the Obama administration, where he says to the students at the University of Chicago, I don't want you to be safe ideologically. I don't want you to be safe emotionally. I want you to be strong. That's different. He says, I'm not going to take the weights out of the gym. This is the gym. Put on some boots, learn how to deal with adversity. Okay, I'm mixing his metaphors there. He also talked about, I'm not going to pave the jungle for you. The point is, even if I grant every assumption in your question, the worst thing we could do for such students is say, okay, therefore, we're going to take away any reminders. We're going to smooth the path. We're going to prepare the path for you, not you for the path of life. That's a good way to damage them for life.
And yet university administrators seem to indulge in this kind of conduct all the time. How come?
Absolutely. It's the safest thing for them to do because the nature of bureaucracies everywhere is defensive. Bureaucrats get, campus administrators are not the villains, but they are in a system of accountability where if something goes wrong and they had failed to act, they failed to do something to prevent it, they can get in big trouble. Now, what they do to prevent it does not need to be effective. So all over America, whenever anything happens, people demand diversity training. Now, there's a lot of evidence, or I should say, there's no evidence that diversity training actually improves the racial climate. A big review just came out recently. Most people in the corporate world know that diversity training doesn't work. But everybody does it because as long as you're doing it, it's CYA, you've covered your posterior. So campus administrators are doing all sorts of things, not to solve the problem. They're actually doing things that tend to make the problem worse, but it looks like they're being active, and so they're covered.
Well, if I recall this properly from the book, you have talked to university presidents who acknowledge that you are right on this, but they're not prepared to do anything about it. How come?
Exactly. That's right. Being a university president has always been a difficult job. You're at the middle of all these different people demanding, the students, the faculty, the donors and trustees, they're all demanding that you do something. And you don't have nearly as much power as a corporate executive. So I don't want to be too hard on the university presidents. They have a very difficult job. But everyone I talk to says the job has gotten much more difficult in the last 2 or 3 years because the students are so likely to object to something served in the dining hall, something that appeared in the newspaper. The students are so reactive and so quick to raise a fuss on social media, and the president now is in the hot seat. So as one university president said, universities are becoming ungovernable. This is not a good situation for anyone. what I'm hoping is that in the coming year, university presidents are going to stand up and do a better job of setting norms, saying to the freshmen as they come in, okay, look, we're trying to do something difficult here. We're trying to do something special here. We're trying to create a community. And we're all going to have to learn norms to be more polite. We're going to have to try to give less offense, but we also have to take less offense. We've got a lot of diversity here. We've got to give each other the benefit of the doubt. So I'm taking away the formal bureaucratic procedures by which people can report each other anonymously. We're going to work on skills to resolve conflicts at the lowest level possible. Things like that, I think, would go a long way to creating a climate in which students learn the basic skills of getting along with people who differ from them.
Well, let's take a few moments here and talk about some of life's, I think you call them the great untruths. And we know the great line from Nietzsche, which is, of course, everything that doesn't kill you makes you stronger. You seem to think we have this completely, well, this is a pejorative way of putting it, but you seem to think we have this ass backwards nowadays. Explain why.
Yeah. So the basic principle, the basic psychological principle there is antifragility. That's Nassim Taleb's word for systems that gain from disorder. So as we were talking about with the peanut allergies, the immune system is antifragile. Kids are antifragile. That means if you protect them, you hurt them. You have to let them have graded experiences to the point where they can fend for themselves from the common threats of life. So that's the whole point of our book, is that we are overprotecting. We're doing all sorts of things purportedly to help kids. A lot of them backfire. We've got to stop doing that. That's the first great untruth. Your second great untruth is that you should always trust your feelings. What's wrong with that? Well, so the book has its origins in Greg Lukianoff's major depressive episode. Greg was prone to depression. In 2007, he had a suicidal depression. He checked himself into a hospital just in time. When he was released, he enrolled in cognitive behavioral therapy. He learned to catch the distorted thought processes that depressed and anxious people go through, catastrophizing, mind reading, black and white thinking. So he learned to catch this terrible thinking, and when you catch it and you negate it by looking for evidence, you're actually released from the depression. In 2013, Greg began noticing that students on college campuses were doing this. Greg runs the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, arguing for free speech rights for students. So Greg began seeing this in 2013. I began seeing it in 2014. Part of critical thinking is you might want to make a certain argument because you need to in order to win, but you have to look for evidence. That's what critical thinking is about. We need to be teaching students to question their initial assumptions and look for evidence, ground their claims in evidence. Instead, what we're teaching them is, well, you know, everyone has their truth, their lived experience. How dare you try to question somebody's report about something? How dare you question their lived experience? Now, of course, nobody can question that you had an experience. But if we're going to say, I have special rights to weigh in on an issue because of the way I feel in my special authority, I mean, that kind of thinking doesn't belong at a university. It's an error, and the more we do it, the worse off we are. Well, I wonder if you think it belongs in the White House, because I think many of us famously remember George W. Bush looking into Vladimir Putin's eyes and saying, I got a sense of his soul, I think I can read him, I base it all on my gut, and I'm going with that. Isn't going with your gut a big part about being an American? From up in Canada, I guess it looks that way. And yeah, it doesn't tend to work out all that well. My early research is on moral intuition. It's true we have strong intuitions, we tend to follow them. But I'm a big believer in the fact that we need well-constituted groups to check our intuitions. So good leaders should have good intuitions, but they should also have trusted advisors that they check them with. Professors and administrators should be trusted advisors who can say, you know what, that's really disordered thinking. You know what, that's not true. But in the last few years, we've all been in a kind of a defensive crouch. We're hesitant to challenge students in any way lest we set them off. The third great untruth that you tell us is that life is a battle between good people and bad people. And I don't have to tell you, there are millions of Americans who believe that to their very soul. But what's wrong with it? That's right. What's wrong with it is that the human mind evolved for tribalism. It evolved for intergroup conflict. We're very good at that. We fall into that at the drop of a hat. Now, if you look at hunter-gatherer groups and primitive, pre-civilized, I have to watch what I say. What's the proper term? Before pre-agricultural societies, I suppose we should say, right? Early agricultural societies. There's a lot of violence, there's a lot of intergroup conflict, but they're also actually very interested in trade. They can turn that down. Now, if you're creating a large, multi-ethnic, diverse democracy like the United States or Canada, or if you're creating a diverse university, it's really, really important that you turn down the tribalism, not up. But what students are learning in some majors, it's not in the sciences, it's not in most departments, but in certain areas, nowadays they're called the grievance studies, for example, and also some parts of sociology, education, social work. The ideology taught is that there are the privileged groups and then there are the victim groups. And privileged, those people are bad, the people on the bottom are good. And your job is to fight the power structure. That's why, as they often say in those departments, punching up is good. So saying terrible things about the privileged group is a good thing, but you should never punch down. Now, you can make an argument for that if you like, but what does it do to kids who are 18 years old to tell them, you know what, the world is a zero-sum game. I want you to see the world as a zero-sum game where there are good people and bad people, and your job is to identify the bad people and hurt them. I mean, this is not a recipe for success. If you really want to have an inclusive society in which students of color, LGBTQ students can go out into the world and become forces of nature and take risks and move up in the world, don't tell them the world's against them, that everybody hates them, that every institution is stacked to keep them down. That's what I just learned in my diversity training here at NYU, that every institution is a system of interlocking systems designed to keep white people up and black people down. Really? That's what NYU is? So it's kind of lost touch with reality because it's hitched up with ideology.
In which case, in our last few minutes here, we talked earlier about how parents ought to be allowing younger kids to play. Let's take it down the road. I'm sure there's a lot of people watching us right now who've got kids in high school who are in the throes of putting their university applications together and about to go next fall into the big independent world of post-secondary education. What kind of advice would you give to the parents and the kids that they should consider to lead a better life? So
it's very important to not just look at the rankings of a school. I don't have good data on Canadian universities. I don't know enough about it. What I can tell you about American universities is that in the Northeast and the West Coast, especially, is where you get this much more ideological, sort of walking on eggshells, fearful speech culture. So I'd be very careful if Canadians are applying to American universities in the Northeast or the West Coast. Try to look into it, try to get a sense, you have to talk to students and always ask them, do you feel, if you do a campus visit, do you feel that in classes you can speak up and say what you're thinking, or do you self-censor a lot because you're afraid of how people will react to you? So you really have to look at the speech culture. Personally, I will not. The only top schools in the United States that I would like right now for my kids to attend are the University of Chicago and Princeton. Those are the only top ones that I think seem to be really trying and doing a good job of it. Let's see.
Do you like the notion of a gap year?
Other advice? Oh yes, my goodness. Thank you for reminding me. Yes, because as we said earlier, kids are not hitting developmental milestones as quickly. Jean Twenge reports that an 18-year-old today in the United States has about the maturity level, the experience level of a 15-year-old from 30 years ago. Now, 30 years ago, we didn't think 15-year-olds were ready for college. Today, most 18-year-olds probably are, but a lot are not. And so we think that students are doing so badly in college. The mental health crisis the rates are staggering. We think that every university should say, we will give preference to kids who've taken a year or two off, who've lived away from their parents. American parents are so grossly overprotective for the most part. We should encourage students to live and work somewhere else, join the military, get a job in some other state. Ideally, if you're in a progressive part of the country, you should move to a conservative part and vice versa. That would solve a lot of problems at the same time. But I'm hopeful that universities will address the mental health crisis head on and say we've got to stop bringing 18-year-olds in who are morally dependent and who have not had enough independence before they arrive here. It's bad for them, and boy, is it bad for everybody else.
And just finally, the failure to follow this advice will result in what?
The failure to follow the advice will lead systemically to a further decline in the speech quality and vibrancy of American universities. I believe this is happening in many of the UK universities too. Again, I don't know enough about Canada yet to say. So it's leading to a decline of the universities, a decline of trust in the universities, especially on the right, but also across the board in the United States now. It leads to students who don't get the most out of their education, students who go to college and don't have the kinds of challenging conversations, professors who provoke them and make them question things. A lot of us are teaching defensively. Students are talking in a self-censored way. everybody suffers. College is not as interesting or fun or growth promoting as it used to be.
That's Jonathan Haidt. He's professor of ethical leadership at New York University Stern School of Business and the co-author of The Coddling of the American Mind, How Good Intentions and Bad Ideas Are Setting Up a Generation for Failure. Let's hope we've saved a few generations from failure by having you on our program tonight. Thanks, Professor Haidt.
Thank you, Steve.
The Agenda with Steve Bacon is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.